Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Club Learning webinar tonight, Protecting Vulnerable People. I'm going to introduce Doug McDonald to you in just a minute, but just remind everybody that I'll be monitoring the chat room. We'll have some breakout rooms later on. We are recording everything, so we must be on our best behavior. And we'll have this all on file for those that are really interested and want to see a copy or hear a replay of everything we do and accomplish and say tonight. So with that, the lead tonight is Doug McDonald. Doug McDonald is the chair of the Vulnerable Sector Committee. He will introduce our presenter tonight. Doug is the president-elect of the Heritage Park Club. I know he does some community association work, and he's a long-time leadership role with the Boy Scouts of Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug to get his presentation and his colleague introduced, and on with the show, as they say.
Great, thanks, Brian. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. For some of you, the good news is I'm not the one doing the presentation tonight. Tonight's presentation presenter is Bob Golan. Bob's a member of the Rotary Club of Okotoks. Has been a member in both the West Edmonton and the Creston clubs. He's a past president of the Creston BC club, and he's currently the vice president of the Okotoks club and their club protection officer. Bob moved to Okotoks in 2018 with Mary, his life partner of, I can't believe it's 38 years, Bob. She doesn't, like, you look that old, but anyway. Before retiring in 2017, Bob was with the RCMP in 3 different provinces, 1 territory, and also in international policing. It makes me tired reading that he did 14 transfers in 35 years, and his last position was the officer in charge of community policing for RCMP Alberta. After retiring, Bob started traveling across the country doing various management training courses for the Canadian Training Resources, and for the last 3 years, he's traveled Alberta, providing volunteer training to the Alberta Citizens on Patrol Volunteer Board members and to the Calgary Crime Stoppers Association. But most important to me, Bob's been an invaluable member of the District Protecting Vulnerable People Committee since he put up his hand at one of these sessions and asked a good question. So I'm going to start sharing. And Bob, when you want me to change slides, just say so.
Okay, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you or interact with you tonight in regards to protecting vulnerable people. As Doug had said, I'm a member of his board, and it's amazing how you can become a member by just actually asking a question. But it worked out very well, and I found that it's been a really enjoyable time working with them. And they asked me to talk a little bit about protection officers and some of the responsibilities that the club presidents are going to have to be taking on in the new year. So if you want to change the slide. Okay, so what we're going to look at is what is the definition of a vulnerable person. And it looks at the Criminal Records Act, and it's a person who, because of age, disability, other circumstances, whether temporarily or permanent, are in a position of dependency or at greater risk than the population, general population, of being harmed by a person in authority or trust relative to them. So basically, it's a pretty broad definition, but it's someone that needs help. Next. Why did we do vulnerable sector checks? Okay, there's part of dealing with volunteers, and they're also required by law here in Canada. If you are a person who has control or charge of someone who is identified in that vulnerable sector group, you have to become or get some vulnerable sector training. Most organizations in Canada right now are just looking at like sports coaches. Like I coached volleyball to the national level. The last few teams that I coached is I had to submit a yearly criminal record check. Teachers also have to do it. And it all comes down to each organization as to how long of gaps between when you have to submit these documents. So for Rotary, I believe we're doing 3 years once you do your vulnerable sector check. And the difference between a vulnerable sector check and a criminal record check. A criminal record check is when they go in and they'll look at CPIC to see if you've had any criminal convictions in Canada. They also look at your local indices or your local community to see if you've been a person of interest in any investigations. What a vulnerable sector check is they actually go into criminal records that have been removed from the normal system because of a pardon to see whether or not there is actually a historical criminal conviction that was pardoned due to sexual assault. So that's why it's a 2-stage. It's not just your normal criminal record check that a lot of people have to do for a job. When you go in, and that's why we're going to talk a little bit later about the letter, is it identifies what position you're going to be doing and that it has to be a vulnerable sector check, not just a criminal record check. Next slide, please. So looking at the Rotarian Code of Conduct, I'm confident that all of you, because you've been involved in Rotary for so long, all live and breathe this, that as a Rotarian, I will act with integrity and high ethical standards in my professional and personal life, deal fairly with others, use my skills to mentor, improve, and avoid behavior that reflects adversely on Rotary and other Rotarians. So Rotary International has come out saying that we will have vulnerable sector checks, policies. Our district governor has come out saying that our district will certainly have these policies as well, and she has been working closely with our board to ensure that we get these policies up and running. I understand that earlier all of you were sent a copy of the district policies, so that hopefully you had a chance to review them. Next slide, please. Okay, so a vulnerable sector or police information check. Okay, so if you're working or volunteering with vulnerable people such as children or anyone who falls within that definition on the Criminal Records Act, whether or not you are working in a position that your employer or organization feels that a criminal record or vulnerable sector check is required. And this is where a lot of people get confused. I know when the question that I asked Doug when he presented was he had brought up that some clubs were talking about doing a vulnerable sector check for every single volunteer. He explained that my previous profession was a police officer, and when I was in charge of community policing, one of the things that we had to take a look at was when is it appropriate to ask for a vulnerable sector check. Under the Identification of Criminals Act, it clearly states in there that you have to identify the position or the reason why you need a vulnerable sector check. You can't just come in and say, I'm a member of Rotary, I'm going to be volunteering in my community, and I need a vulnerable sector check. Because technically, they cannot then issue it to you. They could do a criminal record check if there's a reason for it, but vulnerable sector checks, because they are restricted, have to be a very clearly identified why you need this. So it's more geared towards the position rather than the individual. So if you go in with your letter from district, and in it, it'll say that I am now volunteering to work with youth within my community through RILA or RIDAC or any of the other youth organizations, there's the specific reason why you need the vulnerable sector check and not just a criminal record check. If you go in and just say in the letter that all I'm going to be doing is attending club meetings and be a Rotaries who attend meetings and eat, then you don't need this vulnerable sector check. So when they do it, they use CPIC, which is the Canadian Police Information Center. It is a system that's right across Canada. Every recognized police service in Canada has access to it. And it will list in there all criminal convictions. Do not be worried if you go in and they say they have a hit on your gender and date of birth. When I went into Okotoks here, And when I did it for coaching, every single time I went in to get a criminal record check or vulnerable sector check, there was a hit on my date of birth and my gender, which means that somebody in Canada born on the same date that I am, who is male, has been convicted of a sexual assault. So at that point, they will ask you to supply a set of fingerprints. You supply them, they'll send them out depending on which system they have. I understand that most municipal police services and the RCMP, all in Alberta now, have the electronic ability to send them right to Ottawa. So they actually take your fingerprints on an instrument that's in their offices and electronically send them, but you do have to sign a release for them to do that. They will then send it to Ottawa, check your fingerprints to make sure they are in fact not the person who has the criminal record, and then we'll send back a letter saying that you are clear. I imagine that you guys have been watching the news lately, and the province of Alberta has recently put forward a bill to stop people who have been convicted of sexual assaults from changing their names. Because that was a common occurrence for people who did get convicted of a sexual assault. Once they were released from custody, is they would go in and get an official name change so that then they could not be recognized or identified. This is why we do the fingerprints, so that you cannot change your date of birth, but you could, prior to this new bill, if it does get passed, change your name. Okay, if we could change again, screens. So for club committee chairs and regular members, your responsibility under this policy, and this is quoted straight from district policy, is to prevent all forms of bullying, abuse, harassment, exploitation, or neglect, safeguard the welfare of everyone who participates in Rotary programs, including vulnerable people, ensure that everyone, and particularly vulnerable people, understand their rights and how to protect themselves from bullying, abuse, harassment, exploitation, or neglect, prevent anyone who may put vulnerable people at risk from participating, complete all required volunteer screening requirements. I hate sitting here and looking at a screen and reading it to you, because most of the times you can do that yourself. But basically, it is to practice common sense. If you feel that you're going to be participating in an activity or community event or volunteer opportunity with your club, and it's going to deal with vulnerable people, you should be asking the question of either your protection officer or your chair, club committee chair, has this been looked at in regards to vulnerable sector, to make sure that everybody who's involved, if in fact that it should be, we're dealing with people or we're in charge of people who fall within the vulnerable sector classification, that everybody who's participating has had the screening or the training required to participate. If you have not had this screening and security clearance to participate, you should be stepping away. Okay, so as a club president, okay, yeah, you can go to club, Doug. Your job, and I understand a lot of you are your president-elects and will be president next year. So it's your responsibility to make sure that you do have a club protection officer. Now, do you just sit down at a regular meeting and say, throw it out to the group and say, hey, who wants to be our protection officer this week? No. You need to look for someone who has the necessary skills and the commitment to take on this responsibility. And you're going to see later on that there is a fair amount of work for the protection officer. And so it's really good if you do have someone who's got previous law enforcement or a legal background. Certainly they come prepared and with the toolkits necessary to do the job. But even someone who's had to do a lot of interviewing, meeting one-on-one with people, and understanding the legal system, it's important that you look for the right person. And so instead of just throwing it out on the club meeting saying, hey, who wants to take this on? Take a look at the skills and strengths of your individual club members and then approach them. So it is your responsibility as club president to identify someone within your club who will take on this role. It's to ensure that you have policy. For our club, All we did was we took district policy, changed the name, a few of the words in there, and adopted it as our own. There's no sense reinventing the wheel unless you want to, but it is required that you should have district policy in regards to protecting, or I'm sorry, club policy in regards to protecting vulnerable people. And in conjunction or in working with your protection officer is to ensure that it's updated annually. And then as each new club activity, volunteer opportunity, or project comes up, is to look at this project through the lens of vulnerable sector policies. Do we need to ensure that all participants have the training? How much are we going to be involved with people who fall within the definition of vulnerable sector? Are we going to be in charge of people who fall within the definition of vulnerable sector? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then you have to make sure that every volunteer involved actually has gone through the screening and the training that's provided by district. Next one, please. So your club protection officer, and you'll notice that this screen is full. To take the district training is assigned by your district training officer. I'm not sure if this district has assigned a district training officer yet, but once they do, their role is going to be setting up certainly annual training, but we're talking and looking at that right now is someone who is comfortable interviewing people, is comfortable talking about the legal system, and fully understands what the definition of vulnerable sector is and how it needs to be applied to every project. It's to make sure, and you'll notice that there is a link here to the district screening letter. If you go to your local RCMP detachment, you need to have a letter from Rotary explaining why you need this vulnerable sector check. And you'll notice if you did have the opportunity to click on that letter earlier, that it clearly identifies what role you'll be playing within your club as to why you need the vulnerable sector check. Having said that, being a detachment commander at 14 different locations, I was not aware of this for a big part of my career. If someone came in and just said, hey, I need a vulnerable sector check, and here's a letter saying that I'm a member of Rotary, we generally just did it. Or if I'm going to be coaching volleyball, or I'm going to be doing this, we just did it because as a detachment commander, a lot of times we didn't understand the Identification of Criminals Act, and that it was actually a criminal offense that you can be charged with, a federal offense for asking for this of someone within your club without justification. It wasn't until I took on my last role when I was in charge of this particular responsibility for the province of Alberta that I really started to understand how important it is that we assign the vulnerable sector check not to the person, but to the role that they're taking on. Okay. Again, as a club protection officer, it's your responsibility to make sure every new activity or project or volunteer opportunity that comes up is viewed through the lens of the vulnerable sector policy. To review the policy and training with your president every year to ensure that it's current and updated. And the biggest part here is every detachment, every police service, every municipal police service has a little bit different policies in regards to how to report an offense. Because as a protection officer, you will not be investigating. If someone comes to you, if one of the students that we're hosting, if one of your club members comes to you, if someone, agency where we did volunteer, comes to you with a complaint, it is not your job to investigate it. It is your job to understand who you're supposed to report it to, and to ensure that the person or persons making the complaint or involved in the complaint are safe. You would then pass it on to the proper investigational agency. So it is super important that you do sit down with your local detachment someone from your local police service. If you live in Calgary, it was brought up, we don't want every single Calgary club approaching Calgary City Police and saying, hey, I'm the protection officer for my club in the city of Calgary. We would like to know what your policies are in regards to reporting an offense. I would suggest that all of the clubs in Calgary have one person approach Calgary and get a unified response. I will be approaching Okotoks detachment here and explaining who I am, what I do, and if I do get a complaint, how would they like me to approach them, and develop a protocol which will be put into my club policy on how to forward these complaints. I can't stress enough how important this one step is, because relationship building is huge. When you contact your local police agency, they should already have a protocol in place or understand what your role is in Rotary. It's very frustrating if you have to sit there and explain it time after time after time. Hopefully you never will have to, but getting the protocol up and running first is awesome. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm running through these slides. I feel like I'm going very fast because we're getting pretty close, but I have some homework for you guys to do during this presentation at the very end, which is going to take some time. So the district protection officer is appointed by the district governor and is generally for a 3-year term. We've adopted this in our club here in Okotoks, is that our term will be for 3 years as well. There has been some talk about staggering that so that not every single club protection officer becomes renewal at the same time. But it's entirely up to your club as to how long you want to assign these protection officers. You must complete the district security training and security screening, which means going through the district training, getting your criminal record check and vulnerable sector checks done and submitting them, and ensuring that training is reviewed and updated on an annual basis. As the district protection officer, we're asking that you will host a training session for all club protection officers in the district once a year. And it's just a matter of sitting down with them, going through any new changes, expectations, so that we don't have a whole bunch of clubs doing things different ways, but the district protection officer would sort of be the unifying person, would bring everybody together to make sure that we're all working the same way. They would also be the resource person. If your club protection officer has a question, this is the person that they would reach out to. Because we are setting it for a 3-year time frame as your protection officer, we would ask that the protection officer or district protection officer do an audit on 33% of the clubs in district to ensure that their policies are kept up to date, that they do have an identified protection officer, and to make sure that they contact those officers and are aware of that you're a resource to them. And to provide training to the identified positions as indicated in District 5360 policy. There will be a follow-up training session for all club protection officers, in where we will go a lot more into like how to conduct an interview, what types of questions to ask and not ask, how not to become part of the investigation, developing relationships and protocols, working on policy. These are all things that we're working on right now, so that when we do get up and running and these protection officers are ready to go, that we'll have training in place for them. Next slide, please. Okay, so the volunteer screening procedure, you're filling out a form, okay? You need to go into your local detachment, RCMP detachment, or Calgary City Police. You can just do it right online. Request a vulnerable sector check. Remember, do not show up at their office without the letter from district, clearly identifying what position you will be working with to show why you need a vulnerable sector check. When you go to the detachment or the city police, some, depending on the size, if they have a municipal contract, It's the municipality that decides whether or not they will charge for this vulnerable sector check. When I went to Okotoks here, I assumed it would be for free because it's a volunteer position. I walked in and they said, wait a second, you need to pay $55 and we only accept cash. And so I had to leave because I didn't have $55 with me. Went to the bank, grabbed money, came back to the detachment, talked to someone new at the counter, and they said, oh no, this is for Rotary. This is for a volunteer position. It's free. Then they queried my name. Because of my date of birth and my gender, there was a hit, at which time I then did have to pay the $25 to do the criminal record check because they had to send it to Ottawa. This is a fee that is set by Ottawa, and each municipality does not have a choice on that. So my criminal record check in Okotoks was free, but I did, because I had to submit fingerprints, pay the $25. So maybe give them a phone call before you go there and just ask what do they charge, or if they charge for volunteer. For the province of Alberta, they're not, for the RCMP, they are not supposed to charge for criminal record checks unless they have a municipal contract, at which point then it's entirely up to the town that they work in whether or not there will be a charge. Undergo a personal interview. We're working on the questions that will be used in this personal interview. As well, you need to provide references, only one of which can be a Rotarian, and none of them can be your spouse or a family member. That was supposed to be a joke. I never saw the facial. This is hard on Zoom because I can't see your body language to see whether or not it actually got through, or else I heard a whole bunch of groaning in the background. Okay, you cannot work with vulnerable people, and Rotary International and District 5360 policy says if you have a criminal record as defined by a criminal act, if you have been pardoned for a sexual offense, that's where the vulnerable sector check would show up. If you haven't received a pardon, a sexual offense will show up on your normal criminal record. But if you received a pardon, it would then show up in your vulnerable sector check. Okay. If you have any outstanding criminal charges, whether if you have a recognizance undertaking or any other type of court order release stopping you from having firearms or explosives, or have no contact with persons because of criminal event, if you have an order under the child protection legislation which restricts you from having access to kids, okay? So these are all pretty clear. If you have a criminal record, or you are under investigation, or you have a history of any of these things, I would suggest that you don't bother trying to apply for the volunteer screening. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what we're going to be doing is breaking you up into different groups, depending on how many people we have here. You're going to be given 2 scenarios, and we want you to ask in your groups these 3 questions. Should this person be screened? Why or why not? Because the answer no just doesn't cut it. We want to know your reasoning behind this. Okay. And if it is a no, or if you feel that there's other steps that can be taken to help protect vulnerable people, we would like to hear that too. Remember, there are no wrong answers here. They are just an opportunity for you to talk in your groups. And this is going to be a very first for me. We're going to be giving you, I understand, how long, who's running the breakout rooms?
10 minutes, Bob.
Okay, we'll be giving you 10 minutes to have these discussions in your groups. And then we're going to be asking you to come back and to answer these 3 questions for the 2 questions, for these 3 issues for the 2 scenarios that have been provided to you. So which groups had question number 1?
Number 12 did.
And number 1 did.
Okay. Do you have a spokesperson who could talk about this?
We do.
Go for it.
Okay, the first one is a host mom is taking some girls up to Edmonton, staying in a hotel overnight. A couple of things to consider is that they're leaving the region. They're going to a different district. It's going up to Edmonton, and that it's young girls. But the part that we saw was that she's a host mom, so we assumed that she would have done all the paperwork that needs to be done to be a host mom, including the vulnerable sector, to be with those young girls.
Okay. So yes, they need the training. Can you do something to make it any safer?
We just figured that she already would have gone through the training and had done the forms, so she would know what she was doing because she had been working with the young girls before.
Okay. So as a committee, we've discussed this, and I can tell you about my history. I was the chief of police. I have gone through all the criminal record checks, the vulnerable sector checks, having to submit my fingerprints, and I'm coaching a group of girls and staying in a hotel room. I would never go and put myself in this position without a second adult there. Because if an allegation is made, then it's he said, she said, she said, she said, but it's one-on-one. You always want to make sure that there is a secondary person there. As simple as if you're driving them to the airport, I would suggest that you have a second person, a second responsible adult. And if you can, make sure that they've also had the vulnerable sector training and checks. Really good question. Okay. Who had number 2? A different group.
Okay. Oh, number 2, that wasn't us. Okay.
Group 2 had 2.
Okay.
We said that yes, you should have your vulnerable check, and it's mainly because you are having lunch with several of the residents and the staff. And why we were thinking it's not just something physical. You could have someone sitting beside an elderly person and harassing them. They still have to know what's right and what's wrong. And then the other thing, how to keep them safe, is also to keep your eye out on the other Rotarians and how they're engaging, as well as we also thought, well, you could also watch the staff.
And I'm not going to sit here and say that anything is, we always want to look at the safety of the individuals, the safety of the people who are following it. So local people staying in a local senior center definitely fall within the definition of that vulnerable sector group. But that would exclude anyone in your club who hasn't had this training to volunteer for this project. So legally, we're not in direct control of these seniors. We should never, in regards to, do we need it as an individual, everyone attending? No. How can we make it safer? Is making sure that everyone attends, understands clearly that they can never be in a room alone with any of these individuals. And to give you an example, what happened is there was a church group that was volunteering at a senior center. And one of the people actually went into the room, the room assigned to the seniors, and were taking money from them.
So are you saying we do not need a volunteer check there?
We don't need, as a Rotary, to have someone with a vulnerable checked. But the other question is the training for our individuals going there to volunteer. We're having lunch, but you don't go into their private rooms with them. You're never alone one-on-one with them. And also the question we're going to ask the organization or the senior center is to ensure that they do have someone who is a supervisor, who has had all the training and has had the criminal record checks, and every staff working there should have had this, be present at all times.
So Bob, I think the key thing that's the difference in the way this one's worded is we will have lunch with several of the residents and staff. If we had unsupervised contact with the seniors because there were no staff, that would be a different story.
Yeah, like if all of a sudden we were in charge, they assigned us 5 staff, or I'm sorry, 5 residents, then the person who's in charge has direct control would have to have had this training. Yes.
And that's the difference in the nuance of, and that's why we're really asking clubs to have a look at this instead of saying like everybody, nobody, whatever. It's looking at the situation as a direct and unsupervised contact with vulnerable people. And the way, and actually, Linda, we worded that one intentionally to foil you. But anyway.
And you foiled us. You foiled me.
That's who I was after.
Yeah, because the simple answer, if we were just to say, okay, everybody has to have it. Unfortunately, I know in our club, when I brought it forwards and we had a presentation on it, we had a couple of our club members who said, I'm not interested in that at all. So they have to then clearly understand that there's certain club activities that they can't volunteer with. And when I talked about what's the role of your club protection officer, is meeting one-on-one with every member and going through this policy and letting them know so that they fully understand that there's some club activities that they maybe can't volunteer for unless they're willing to do the vulnerable sector checks.
Bob, sorry, Bob, can I ask just one question?
Yep.
Okay, there's 2 things here. There's the criminal record check, correct? And the vulnerable sector check.
Yep.
They are 2 different things.
They're 2 different things, but they're also tied in together.
Okay, but let me just continue then. The criminal record check, I'm going to ask, do all Rotarians require the criminal record check?
No.
Okay,
Oh.
they do not. So I can have an individual in a Rotary club who says, I don't want it, and that's fine, right?
Yep.
But they cannot participate in a situation where there is a vulnerable person.
No,
That's correct.
the
Well, where we're in direct control of the vulnerable person.
So what's the difference between a vulnerable sector check, which is for the role, not the person, and the police record check? Because we've been asking all our new Rotarians to get the police record check before they can become a Rotarian, so that we know, that they're not criminals, basically. But you were saying that you shouldn't apply for the VSC unless it's for a specific role.
Yes.
But in actual fact, Rotarians don't actually have to have either to become a Rotarian. Is that correct?
My understanding is yes. Like I've never had to do a criminal record check for any of the 3 Rotary clubs I've joined. The difference between a criminal record check, if I'm going to work for, I just applied for Stats Canada to be a district supervisor. They asked me to complete a criminal record check. Because of the position, I'm going to be access sensitive information. So they've made me do a criminal record check, but they're not going into vulnerable sector because I'm not going to be dealing or in control of anybody who falls within the definition.
So sorry, I was going to say, so this is district policy. I Mary's on the line here. I'm here, Rick here. This is district policy then, that you don't need either.
I'm going to let someone from district answer that.
Yeah, because we've always said everybody.
Okay. If you read district policy, there is nothing in there saying that any Rotarian has to have a criminal record check prior to joining Rotary. I just want to clarify the vulnerable sector check, because the vulnerable sector is where they're going into pardoned records.
Yeah.
So there has to be a very specific reason why you would ask for a vulnerable sector. And that's why it has to be focused more on the role and not the individual.
Yeah,
Okay.
we understand that. I'm just wondering, is there anyone from a club out there who doesn't require their members to have a police record check? I'd just like to know.
Heritage Park doesn't.
Okay.
So Doug, you agree with this? Sorry, Doug, you agree
Calgary
with this,
does.
right?
Yeah,
Doug McDonald?
back, Martin, when we when we were in the first phases of the policy review and the conversation about every Rotarian being screened came up, we actually had legal advice that pointed out that there was no Rotary reason for people to provide a criminal record check as a condition of membership. And that, but for example, Linda put in the chat a comment about there are changes to Alberta incorporation for societies now that if you're a board member, you're going to be required to have a police record check now. And there are some things like that, but there's nothing in, and I actually, when we went through that a year and a half ago, I actually checked with RI, and they have nothing in the RI document that says that a police record check is a condition of Rotary membership. Now, if your club was everybody was dealing with, I don't know, you're running a casino every week and everybody has to be screened to be there, then that's probably a condition in your club. But that's role, to Bob's point, that's role specific.
Thank you. I really appreciate the clarity on that, because obviously we've had
There's
some
been confusion,
in
yeah.
our club. Thanks very much.
Yep.
And, Bob, I might just add that in the Canmore Club, we have a youth committee, and everyone in our youth committee is required to get a vulnerable sector check, partly because that gives the committee a lot of flexibility. If we need somebody to do a couple of interviews of students for an award or whatever, we have people ready to do that. Like, it takes time to get this vulnerable sector check. They can't get it done in a week. So
the average time is 3 to 8 weeks.
yeah, so don't wait if you think you might need it, because then it's too late.
And that's why it would be very important in that letter, when you take it in, to identify that I will be part of the youth group, having a direct contact and one-on-one sometimes with the vulnerable sector, i.e. youth.
I think that the challenge with asking every Rotarian to have a criminal background check is who then determines whether or not, you know, like what happens if somebody was caught shoplifting in 1968? Does that preclude them from participating in club activities, and who is going to make that determination?
So Craig, that's actually in the district policy, and that's up to the, actually if that does come up, because it's confidential information that comes in, it doesn't come through the club, it comes direct from the Rotarian to district. On the criminal record, and it's the district governor and myself as the chair of the Protecting Vulnerable People Committee. We simply look at the situation, and you know, if you were charged with armed robbery and convicted 3 weeks ago, we're probably not interested in you. But we have a latitude, and we've had a couple of you know, the most common thing professionally, I know, Bob knows too, is it's the most common one we have is old DUIs, but it's also theft unders, and those are things that we just go by and they go in the file. The club doesn't know about it. Nobody knows about it. It's between you and the system. And this year, and Mary and I had not had to deal with one this year, but it would be Mary and I this year who would receive it, look at it, and say we're good with this or we're not.
Doug and Bob, I'm wondering if it's been great discussion, and
got to
it's
keep
great
moving
for clarification purposes, but I think if you want to get through this, we're getting short on time. Thanks.
Right.
I just looked at the time. We're almost out.
Okay, so let's go to question number 4. Which group had question number 4?
So
Okay.
group 3.
I missed 3. Sorry, question 3. Question 3. I'm the non-Rotarian friend of a host family.
So group 3 had question 3.
There we go.
Okay, so the person requiring the check would be the non-Rotarian friend. It is their son that is a friend of the YAX female, but since the son is underage, we can't do the check on the son. We would have to do the check on both parents if both parents are going. And in order to further protect the student, we would consider sending the host, one of the host parents with them, because of course, that's again more protection for the student. Could this be actually done in the amount of time that that's required? Probably not. So another suggestion was to perhaps advise the students when they do arrive that these checks will be required of people who are not already checked. So not to jump into situations where they would consider going on a weekend and that, yeah, why don't we do that? That would be great. You know, if they're aware, then they'll have less disappointment, because there's no way they could do that in the amount of time that this scenario alludes to.
And I thought that was an awesome point when we were discussing it, is instead of getting ourselves into this situation where we have to be the bad people and tell these students that they can't go, is when we sit down right at the beginning, this could be our district or the club protection officer, sit down with each of these students and just say, you know what, if this scenario comes up, you'd have to say no, because we as a Rotary club, as your host parent, can't release you to someone who hasn't been cleared. So I thought it was just an awesome.
Bad guy.
What's that?
That won't save you from being a bad guy. Having dealt with youth exchange for a long time, they won't remember that anyway.
But at least we could refer it back to that then.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with what you're saying. You're saying in the real world, it won't save you.
Okay. So question number 4.
Room 9 did number 4, and we felt that the vulnerable sector check was not required because as long as the volunteers are not alone or in a position of authority over the vulnerable sector people.
Okay. Is there something that you could do as a Rotary organization who's volunteering to work for this food bank that you could ask a question of this organization to make sure that you're safe?
You could do that, or you could refuse to participate if they wanted to put you in a position that was going to put you in that situation. You say, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. So you have to make sure that they have policies and procedures and that their supervisors have gone all through these security checks for their own organization. Yes, really good. Okay. Question number 5.
Okay, so question number 5, we're group number 5, so we'll take this one. So we're sending our YEX student to a non-Rotary led camp. So 2 factors to consider here. Number 1 is who is transporting this YEX student. I'm assuming they would be a Rotarian and they should be screened to transport the student to the camp. And we need to know that the people at the camp are properly screened as well, because they are non-Rotarians. So we really have no idea whether they've gone through a screening process or not, but that needs to be determined.
Yes, very good answer. And I'm not just sucking up to the district governor. But we have to ask these questions. If we're going to let these students who we're responsible for attend these activities that are outside of Rotary, we have to ensure that the agency that we're turning them over to has done all the proper screenings to make sure that these students are safe. Okay, number 6.
Hi, I'm Robert from group number 6. We took a look at this question and decided that this is probably going to be a group, a large group, probably situation. And so there are potential concerns and problems. We can't go one-on-one. It might be a good idea to have Rotarians team up and go in pairs with the youth. And there are probably going to be parents there as well. And so as long as it remains a group situation, we probably don't need the vulnerable sector check.
Yes. I really like the idea that you guys put forward that you would always go in pairs. And since this is an activity that Okotoks actually does, when we have our application or entry forms, it clearly states in there that any child participating must be accompanied by a parent, so that we then are ensuring that we're never left alone with this child. We're not taking responsibility, so a parent has to be there. But I really like the fact that you brought up and understand that, you know what, even though we're trained, if we've got the security clearing, having that second person there is huge. Okay, thank you. Yes. Has every group now done at least one question?
We couldn't find our question.
We had,
Okay, so let's keep going then.
so Bob, we had a problem with the questions going into the chats. Questions
Yeah,
7
we couldn't find
to 12 did not appear.
Oh, okay. Well, Bernie, you cover one of your answers.
We didn't have the question.
Well, nobody, you got no questions.
No, we had a nice chat about the policy and its history and so on, but we didn't have any question to answer.
Okay, well, I think we've covered the main points. The last slide is any questions that you have as a group.
Hey, Bob, I just have a question around that. The last question we were talking about, I think it was number 6. If our club is hosting an event, is there a certain number of Rotarians that would have to be trained? So say we have 20 kids coming, 6 Rotarians that are trained, and we have other volunteers that aren't. That would be fine as long as none of the untrained volunteers are with the kids or supervising them alone. Is that correct?
That's correct. Because you're going to have Rotarians who don't want to go through the hassle of doing, or normally wouldn't volunteer as a person in direct control of youth. So, but we don't want to turn them away either. So as long as we can say that, yes, they're always going to be partnered up with someone who is trained, or that they will never be in direct control of a person who falls within that vulnerable sector definition, then they're good to go.
So Bob, can I put an example out for everybody?
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, for those who don't, my background for a lot of years was working with Scouts. And we had every fall in East Calgary, we ran an event called the Great Escape, and it was a great big night game with 400 kids and adults out wandering around in the woods in the dark. And I never totally got it, but they did it. Well, to use a dirty word, the Lions clubs came and helped us and cooked for us and did the midnight snack as the kids were coming in off of the trail. And we supervised them doing that. They were never with the kids, and they weren't screened, but it was clear that they had supervisors who were our people who were screened, and they just understood that, and the kids understood that their job was, these were people who were in the kitchen helping out. These weren't program people. These were just people off in the kitchen. And now that I think about it, I don't know why we didn't invite the Rotary Club of Calgary East to do that for us. But anyway, it was the Lions Club of Cheadle.
Doug and Bob, I know we're over time, and most people have stayed on. Could you flip it up a slide and then maybe have Bob lead a rapid fire on questions 7 through 12, which didn't make it out for some reason or other. It's in the chat, but it didn't get to everybody's.
I'm a Rotarian volunteering to drive 3 students to a local camp. Yes, you need to have the security training and clearance, but my suggestion is have a second adult there with you, hopefully a Rotarian who has also been trained. Okay, I am a non-Rotarian volunteering to drive 3 students to camp. No. The host families, the Rotarians responsible for these youth would have to say no unless there is a Rotarian who actually is trained and has all of the necessary requirements to go. We are a host family. My 17-year-old is typically alone with our student who is 15. Under the Criminal Identification Act, we cannot do criminal record checks or vulnerable sector checks on anybody under the age of 18. Having said that, certainly when we're interviewing the parents and the families of host kids, there's a series of questions that are asked to ensure that these kids are in a safe household. And having a conversation with the 17-year-old as to what's appropriate is a good conversation. I'm a leader at Rotary camp. I'm 16 and not a Rotarian. Whichever Rotary group is hosting this camp has to ensure that all participants, all leaders have gone through some sort of training in regards to the vulnerable sector. They cannot get a criminal record check at age 16. Okay. Again, for a non-Rotarian over 18, I would say if they're volunteering at a Rotary camp, that we should be setting up some sort of training as well as the vulnerable sector criminal record checks. And my Rotary Club is selling 50-50 tickets. We have many groups helping. The example of Calgary Stampede. We used to volunteer at the Calgary Stampede and selling tickets, and we would have youth, people who fall within the definition of the vulnerable sector, working in the same booths with us. What you need to do is the person who is responsible for those vulnerable people, and this is a question we're going to ask as a group, if we volunteer our people to participate, what checks and balances have you got in place to ensure both the safety of the vulnerable, the person who falls under the definition of vulnerable sector, as well as our Rotarians? We're not going to take that responsibility on other than asking the questions. Doug, anything else that you feel would be appropriate?
I think as we said with Stampede Park Club when this one came up, was the key thing is, again, it goes back to the two adult rule. It goes back to we're in a different situation. This isn't the RILA or RIPEN. This isn't helping out at the Association for the Rehabilitation of the Brain Injured. These are just people who are coming to help us, and we have to make sure they're safe. But it's not practical to say that we're going to screen 300 Rotary volunteers when most of them, that's really not what they're doing. There's somebody who's there with them, and that's who it's the most important. If I've got a person with a disability who's there helping, the aide who's with them is really the person who's there to help. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and they're the ones who are legally responsible as well.
Yeah.
So we do have some next steps coming up in regards to where we go from here. You are the beneficiaries of the very first training session, so congratulations, you've all passed. But we need to figure out and put up some training on how to deal with the new volunteer management systems. It's a brand new one. I haven't been trained on it. Doug's just looking at it now, I think, trying to get up and running on it. And it will track all of the people who have gone through this types of training with district.
So for everybody who's been using Yay, it's almost the same system. We're just going to be migrating some data, but we want to teach everybody because there are a couple of eccentricities. And that's the other system.
Yeah. And this is something that we're going to be working with for the district as well as the club protection officers on interview training, because you'll remember one of the steps is to meet with every new member coming in to talk about, do they need this training if they want to volunteer for this activity, this project, this volunteer opportunity. And so that the protection officers have to have that ability to speak to people, ask the right questions. And so we're going to be doing some training with the protection officers. And club survey and member survey are, I guess, just coming out this month.
The club survey is going to be out this month. The member survey we're probably will be next month or the month after. But both are really to get a handle on what more help the clubs need with protecting vulnerable people.
Good. Any questions?
Please unmute yourself if you want to ask directly versus going through the chat.
We did have a question in our breakout room. When does this all start?
I believe it's in place right now. It's district policies there. It's been sent out to all the club presidents. So they should be starting to do it right now, getting that protection officer, getting that club policy in place.
So we did go to clubs back before Christmas and have asked, we've been answering questions for clubs to help them adopt the policy. And I know we've been helping clubs with protection officer selection. So we've been doing both.
So everybody who's a president-elect on this training course right now, if it's not done, it means you'll be doing it in your year.
I'm just glad to have you, Bob, on our club. So, and as our youth protection officer. So, a lot of this falls on you, buddy. But thanks.
I was going to say, I was waiting for the president-elect of the Okotoks Club to say, "You're carrying on for another year, Bob."
The wonderful art of delegation.
Doug, one of the questions in the chat, I think it's from Dan Doherty. How can the Calgary clubs coordinate with the police? Robert, something you mentioned before.
That was something Bob suggested, and actually it just came up as we were putting this together. And be patient. What I'm going to suggest is my law enforcement expert on the committee. Hint, hint. Is I'd like to get him and the Calgary clubs together and talk about how to do that. I'm convinced somewhere in one of the Calgary clubs we have somebody from CPS. We must. With all the clubs we've got in Calgary, there's got to be a Calgary City cop somewhere in our system, or a retired.
Mm-hmm.
Bob or Doug, could I ask, you mentioned, Bob, that you had an Okotoks club policy that was a modification of the district policy?
Yep.
Could you email that to everybody that's on this webinar tonight?
I thought that was already done earlier.
No, I meant the Okotoks version.
All we've done is taken the district one, and it's being rewritten right now by our president and her team. But basically, all we've done is change some of the wording, some of the titles on it, and adopted it on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
Somebody asked about recording. So of course, like every other district training, this is being recorded.
Yep.
And it will be, Brian, on the YouTube page next week, probably.
If I may add, Doug, to what you were saying, we have your slide deck. We convert it to PDF. It is shared with everybody participating tonight. Everything is being recorded. We do a few little edits on it before Rick posts it on the district YouTube channel. We even go through the chat room and pull out anything there that is, they'll say, germane to this evening's proceedings, and make that available if people want. So things unfold over the next few working days on that front.
You guys, I gotta say, you guys are doing a great job with this. This is top drawer stuff. Bob, I think the one thing I wanted to add for everybody is, like, if a club's got a question, if a club needs some help with something, please ask. I promise that it doesn't automatically get you on the district committee, but Carol and Karen and Bob and Patricia might be suspicious of that.
Mm-hmm. The other thing we do at the end of the slideshow, the contact information, Doug, will all go back through you. So people may reach out to you once they have those coordinates. Yep. And once we've finalized the recording itself, the video, clubs can use it to train others, inform others.
Yep.
So if there's no further commentary at this point, Doug and Bob, I'm going to let you say goodnight to everybody.
All right. So I want to tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to participate with you tonight, and some really good questions and ideas. Like, I love the scenario part of it. And you know what? I'm sitting there in my group and I'm going, I never thought of that. And so that's why it's an awesome opportunity. And that's why we throw the scenarios out, because we're a small group of individuals who are trying to come up with a policy for an entire district. So thank you for your participation, your input tonight. It's really helpful for us.
Thank you, Bob. Doug?
Yeah, he said it all.
He said it all. Well, we wish everybody good night and look for our follow-up at our end. Thanks, everyone.